Perfect. So thank you so much for joining us, as I indicated, on a cold winter night, and I appreciate those of you who are joining us online as well. We will have an opportunity for questions both from folks in the room and those of you joining us online a little bit later. The way this is going to work, this is our public launch event for the Center for Men and Families, a new campaign around suicide awareness and prevention. We're going to be sharing some remarks about why this campaign is being distributed now, and we're going to be hearing from one of our key advisors, Dr. Dan Bilsker, in just a little bit. And these will be brief, concise remarks. This is not meant to be a long event. This is a launch and a press conference. So this will be recorded and played back later, and also shared with some of our media contacts who have sent us their regrets, but have certainly asked to be kept in the loop on this campaign and its developments. So this will be a fairly brief event compared to some of the other ones some of you might have been at, but we do want to get to questions if there are any. So that will hopefully constitute the bulk of the event. Many of you may know me. If you don't, I'm Justin Trottier, the Executive Director of the Canadian Centre for Men and Families. So we're the hosting organization, which after much preparation and research was finally able to get our Billboard ad up just this week on Monday, in fact. And you are looking at a mock-up of it in front of you here. So this is to kick off a campaign to raise awareness about male suicide rates, and then also looking at how those rates can be reduced and how men who are at risk of suicide, how we can intervene in an appropriate and an effective way to provide support to those male loved ones who may be suffering. As you may know, sort of there up in front of you, men comprise 75% of all completed suicides in Canada. And the unique campaign that this Billboard is at the center of is really focused just as much on loved ones of these men as on the men themselves who are suffering. So we're targeting friends and family and colleagues and coworkers and anybody who has a male loved one in their life, and I'd say most of us do, and to look for the warning signs that those men may be in crisis, maybe in despair, and then to know how to effectively intervene to support those men. And Dr. Bilsker will get into that shortly. When the ad went up on Monday, just by a very tragic coincidence, there was actually a rather public and high-profile suicide death of what turned out to be a male veteran on the steps of the Alberta legislature, which I think many of you have probably read the news. That happened the day our ad went up by, as I say, just a complete, very tragic coincidence. But every day there are, in fact, 11 suicide deaths, on average 8 of which will be men on any given day. So we hear about some of them if they're sort of public enough, but these are happening on a regular basis and we're not talking about them, and that is why we're running this campaign. And in fact, we're launching this campaign here in the Bahen Centre for Information Technology intentionally, because this building has been the location for 2 suicide deaths of young students. We believe young male students, but the university doesn't typically release that kind of information here just this year in this building. And I believe, Joanna, you may correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think that there were 4 suicide deaths overall at U of T this year. She's shaking her head that that's correct. And I don't know that that is an unusual year. So death by suicide is a leading cause of death for young people, for young university-aged men and women. So this campaign is about sharing those facts, the ones I'm sharing with you right now, and also others. And then also looking at some of the situations that are correlated, in particular with male suicide. And research shows, interestingly, that things like separation, divorce, loss of custody to children, loss of custody of children, loss of employment, these major loss events tend to correlate much more strongly with male suicide than they do with female suicide. And the research is very much still ongoing, but it is important to recognize that so that we can then be in a position when a man suffers that kind of loss to be able to intervene at that critical time to provide him with the support that he needs. Now, I just want to thank some of the media that aren't here, but that have already covered or are in the process of covering this important campaign. First of all, Global News Radio earlier in the week has had us on to discuss this campaign. Global TV tomorrow morning. So if you're up early enough, I believe it's 7:30 a.m., we'll have either me or one of our distinguished professor advisors on to talk about the campaign. We're still working on those details. And then on Sunday, Post Media, in the National Post and other papers, will be running a feature story on this, this tragic issue, looking at the experiences of some of the clients that we support at the Canadian Centre for Men and Families. So maybe that's a good segue to tell you a little bit about this hosting agency for those of you who don't know. So the Centre for Men and Families is Toronto's first, so far only, health and social service agency dedicated to boys, men, fathers, and families. Since sprouting up here in Toronto, we've gone on to open sister facilities in Ottawa and Calgary and Edmonton and points beyond. And what we do largely is mental health services, so suicide prevention, other support services for men in crisis, and also looking at programs that intervene at those critical moments. So for example, we have Toronto's only fathering after separation or divorce program, because again, separation divorce is correlated with the potential for suicidal ideation or even suicide attempts or completed suicide. So that is an important moment when we want to be intervening in an effective way. Now, Joanna, who is the client intake coordinator at the center, has kindly agreed to say a few words, a little bit about your experiences and those of the clients. Do you want to come down to take a couple of minutes, please?
Do I use a mic or?
Mic's not active, so just project away.
All right. So hi everyone. My name is Joanna. I am the intake coordinator at Canadian Centre for Men and Families, the Toronto branch. In addition, I am also a student doing my placement here. I'm doing my master's in counseling psychology. So in addition to taking some information about potential service users at our site, I also do some therapy on the side with some clients. One thing I do want to note is a bit of the update in terms of the suicides that have happened at Bahen Centre. So again, unfortunately, there isn't much of a media release on that. There is a small memorial when you enter in on the outside of the St. George Street into Bahen Centre. There's a little small memorial kind of talking about the students' perspective in terms of their reactions of the suicides. So perhaps that may be kind of useful information in terms of understanding some of the information that has been going around and what has happened in response to that. But talking about some of the experiences, some anecdotal experience in terms of what has been happening with what I see in our clientele. I think this campaign is very important in terms of raising awareness for suicide, simply because a lot of the clients that I do see, although not necessarily all of them do share the intention of suicide, they may have suicidal thoughts or ideation. In addition to that, a lot of them do come in with crisis. And I think that's very important in terms of talking about this awareness, because a lot of men do come into our center kind of struggling with homelessness, domestic violence, childhood trauma, other forms of trauma, and or events-based trauma. That makes it very hard for them to kind of cope because they haven't learned strategies to cope. And I think that's what makes it very unique about this particular population working with men. And the fact that it's hard to also access mental health services in general, it's just hard to access, mainly for financial reasons, but especially for men because there hasn't been a lot of voice for men. And given my experience working at the site, a lot of the clients do share that what makes it hard is because they don't feel heard in many mental health services. A lot of mental health services are not used to taking male clientele, and they're not really sure how to address their issues. And there's a lot of stigma around men and mental health. Yeah, that's about it.
Thank you, Joanna.
Thank you for having me.
Will there be an opportunity for questions later?
There will, and I don't think Joanna is going anywhere, so you can address your questions to any of us. Joanna is leading a great team of mostly placement students, some others as well, who do pro bono services, volunteer.
Just had a question more about like how if you find out how people found out about your service.
Yep.
And also what, like if you were to say about demographics, would you be talking about, are there more racialized men that are coming to the center? Are there more, what age of the people there are? Like you can comment on a couple of those.
Certainly. Let me just quickly say that there is a website, which is menandfamilies.org. So a lot of people find us there. Since there aren't a lot of agencies like ours, we become fairly well known not just among men in crisis, but among other agencies that refer men to us. But your questions about the demographics is more of a question for, I think, for Dan, more kind of a research scholarship question. So,
But so you're usually you get clients that are referred by other social service organizations.
And self-referrals, both.
Self-referrals from the internet, from finding.
Yeah, people find us online. Yeah,
Okay,
totally.
thanks.
Yeah, not a problem. It's a good question. This is the ad. Let me say a few quick words about the ad, and then I'll introduce the ad. So the visual features a distressed young man who's hiding his face with a falsely happy mask, and you could even see it sort of cracking under the burden of keeping up this facade. And the text reads, "Appearances can be deceiving. Men often suffer in silence. Help the men you love get the help they need." Now the visual points to the sad reality that a man in crisis often hides his anguish behind a mask of false happiness. And what we're trying to do is through advertisements like these, online dialogue, public events, and this is the first of many. This is just the launch. There will be a number of events in the early new year. We're trying to foster a dialogue to empower family, friends, and coworkers to know how to effectively intervene. At the same time, what we're trying to do is push the envelope, if you will, to create an acceptance, it goes, of a collective responsibility that we all have as both individuals and institutions to empower male loved ones who are in crisis. We're working with other social service agencies to do this, to design intervention programs that target high-risk groups, including in this particular case, boys and men, with programs that are available at those critical moments, as I described. There's a lot of effort right now, and it's praiseworthy effort, to encourage men to move beyond traditional norms of masculinity, to be vulnerable, to ask for help. We support that. We do a lot of that ourselves. At the same time, there's somewhat less of an emphasis on the loved ones of those men being ready when men become vulnerable, which is not something we tend to accept in men. So we need to meet them halfway. And as social service institutions, we have to provide the services for those men that if they do ask for help, that the services are there for them. Because the reality is, while 75% of suicides are completed by men, 75% of those who use social service agencies are women. So there's an interesting sort of inverse statistic there, if you will. We need to make sure that anybody who's suffering, whether they're a man or a woman, has the resources and feels like they would be accepted both within their personal circle and also within social service agencies. And as an agency ourselves, we try to be the bridge between the men, between the families, and between the other agencies that we work with. So if we could just quickly go to the website, lookbehindthemask.com, which you can see is referred to on the Billboard ad. It then brings you here. And then if you go to the site, you will see, first of all, contact. So if you are yourself in crisis or you know a man who is in crisis, then there's information there for where you can go to get help. And let me just take a moment to thank those agencies, because those agencies we named there are ones that actually advised us on the campaign. When you communicate around suicide prevention, of course, you want to be very, very careful the language you use, the visuals you use. And we didn't do this on our own. We did this with the Distress Centres of Greater Toronto, the Centre for Canadian Mental Health Association, Toronto branch, and the Centre for Suicide Prevention. They're not official partners, I want to be clear on that, but they were very, very helpful in terms of responding to early drafts of the ad and helping us to make sure that this campaign would be as effective as possible. I also want to thank our two professor advisors. You're going to hear from one, Dr. Dan Bilsker. Let me just mention them both. First, I'll mention Dr. Rob Whitley, who is principal investigator of the Social Psychiatry Research and Interest Group at the Douglas Hospital Research Center and assistant professor of psychiatry at McGill University. So he's there in Montreal. And then joining us on the line is Dr. Dan Bilsker, registered psychologist and clinical assistant professor at the University of British Columbia, also tasked by the British Columbia government to be a spokesperson for their Stop Overdose BC campaign. So both of these professors are really not just Canadian, but I would say worldwide authorities on men's mental health, suicide prevention, and related areas. So we're going to hear now a little bit from Dr. Bilsker, and then if there are questions for Dr. Bilsker, myself, or Joanna, you can certainly ask them at that time. Thank you.
I'm assuming this is where I step in and start talking. Okay.
Yeah, we're trying to unmute you, I think.
All right. Am I all unmuted and audible?
Hit the speaker front, maybe turn it on.
No. Okay.
At the bottom,
At the front.
the bottom, next to the line cord at the bottom.
Ask your volume. Sorry, Mark.
There, how, am I audible? No, not yet. Testing.
And sing happy birthday or something.
Dan, how are you doing?
How, am I audible?
Yeah, still not hearing you. Sorry, everybody, give us 30 seconds or so.
Looks like this circuit's tripped or something. Let's find the plug.
Well, I guess in the meantime, if there are questions for me, you have one question. I'm not sure I can answer it fully, but did you want to pose it again, please?
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I was just, so, I'm very, very happy to know that the Canadian Centre for Men and Families exists. I just need to know about it.
Mhm.
And so, and I consider myself to be somebody who's pretty well informed and spend some time on the internet. And I walk in here and I can count.
Testing. Am I audible now?
How you're getting the message out there, that the organization is ready to go now. So
Yeah, so save that.
Thank
We'll get back to it. Okay, problem. Okay.
Okay, Dan, yes, we got our speaker going now. We can hear you now.
Oh, great. All right, I'll just start talking. What I want to do is talk about some of the work I've done, looking at men's psychological coping, how men cope with suffering, and in particular as it relates to suicide, as it relates to the most serious and terrible outcome of men's suffering. I've given a lot of thought to it over the years. I've done some research studies, and of course, I've learned a huge amount from my psychotherapy practice, which at this point is about 70% male. Fairly unusual in the mental health system. I think the word gets out that I'm someone who is focused on men's issues, who likes working with men in psychotherapy, and I get a lot of these referrals. I've learned a huge amount by watching how men in different occupations and different life situations handle their suffering, handle their stresses, their challenges, their confrontations, and learning how we can collaborate so that they can cope better and become safer and happier and so forth. So it's a huge amount that I've learned, and there's just a vast amount still to be learned. We're very much at the beginning of a path where we start to really understand how men cope psychologically, and therefore what we might do to reduce their suffering, to prevent their extreme suffering, and therefore to prevent suicide. So first of all, the context for all this, the thing that has drawn so much attention is the very high incidence of completed suicides among men, that 80% of suicide deaths are male. Even though 4 times as often a woman will attempt suicide, when men attempt suicide, they seem to do so with a very settled determination to die. They use more lethal methods. It appears to reflect a greater degree of hopelessness, a sense that there's really nothing left at all, and a real determination to leave. Tragic and awful. But this has come to the attention in a rather belated way. It's surprising how little focus this very dramatic difference has received over time. What's interesting is there's also been a change in the pattern so that the peak of male suicide deaths is now men in their 50s. Used to be men in their 20s, but it's changed over time. We don't really understand it. There hasn't been much research on why is it that middle-aged men are the ones who are killing themselves through suicide most often. Very dramatic, drawing a lot of attention. We're at the beginning of understanding it. Let me talk a bit about a question that arises. People ask about the warning signs of suicide in men. I think of that a bit differently. What I think about is the concept of despair. Despair is a very powerful concept for understanding human psychological suffering I consider it more powerful than all of the clinical terms we use to pretend that we have more knowledge or power than we do. Despair has been a term that's been used throughout human history to describe the state of complete hopelessness, of being in a place where there seems to be no way forward, where the suffering you're experiencing feels intolerable, it feels interminable, it feels like there's nothing you can do and it's inescapable. That state of despair is really what one would be looking to identify, to try to get a sense, perhaps in someone who's not that expressive, who's trying to hide it, conceal it, as it was said, behind a mask. How do you get a sense of that or feel that this person might be in a dangerous place? One of those things would be when the man has recently experienced a very significant loss. Could have been a divorce, end of a relationship in whatever form. It could have been a setback at work, loss of a job, of some sense of personal failure. It could have been a dramatic loss of health integrity. It could have been a health condition that is very serious and has changed this guy's life. Next, is he withdrawing from contact? Is he no longer speaking to others? Is he just pulled into himself and is isolating? Another factor, has he notably or significantly increased his alcohol use? Alcohol is one of the, as I call it, the great potentiators of destructive behavior, including self-destructive behavior. It's a pretty dangerous drug for something that is so much taken for granted in our society. So an increase in alcohol use in a man in the context of a crisis is a warning sign, something really to look out for. It also disinhibits the man, so he's more likely to do something deadly. Does he tell family members or friends that he feels hopeless? Is he describing a sense of frustration, hopelessness, of there being no way forward and no way out? Is he in some way indicating that's his state? Another thing, does he have a history of self-harm, of threats of suicide, or of just acting out perhaps violently when under a high degree of stress? That tendency towards impulsive expression of suffering is something that might also be a warning sign or an indicator of the intensity and danger of his suffering. When those kind of indicators are present, what really feels most critical for friends and family members is to start a conversation, is to connect conversationally to that person. Get that person talking about what it's like. Continue the conversation. Make it a bit harder for him to withdraw into himself, to put on a mask of non-affect or non-experience, to hide. Well, try to maintain that contact, get past that mask. Open up the opportunity, invite him in a safe way to talk about some of what's happening. And of course, as a society, we have to make that process of opening up less scary, less threatening for that man. We have to make that conversation one that he's used to or prepared to engage in. Once we do that, once the conversation begins, it's not just about expressing your feelings, not just about talking about suffering. It's about what happens next, which is collaborative problem solving. You work together to understand what's going on, how he got there, and to help him find ways forward. So on the one hand, just that connection with others is important, that sense of nurturance, the sense that others care about you, but about moving forward, how you do that, who can help you with it, to support him and enable him to find a way to move forward that seems viable, that seems possible, so it doesn't feel like he's facing the blank wall. Now, men in our society are trained in certain ways to cope with psychological suffering in ways that are simply not very adaptive. We don't do a great job of enculturating men to cope with suffering in a positive, useful, effective manner. And the less they can cope with suffering effectively, the greater the risk of despair, of self-harm is. So one of the things we tend to teach men about their psychological suffering is simply to deny it. Nothing's wrong, no problem, just to maintain the mask. Another is to isolate under that condition of suffering, to pull back from others, to pull away, to withdraw. Another, as I've mentioned, is to drink more alcohol. Hard to imagine a worse bit of advice. And another is to get angry. Anger for many men, traditional men, is the preferred mode of expression of emotional distress. And is one that tends to drive other people away, increase their isolation, increase their sense of bitterness, and is dangerous. These are ways of responding or coping with psychological suffering that men have traditionally been taught. They're not very useful. They're not helpful. And it's certainly not helpful to blame the man for coping in these ways. We've kind of taught them to do that. Here's a wonderful quote about how our society in many ways fails men, and a group like this one is so valuable. The quote is from one of the great psychologists, Philip Zimbardo, a book from 2017, who said, "With the rise of toxic masculinity classes on college campuses, masculinity itself is almost treated as a disease. Yet there's a decreasing number of positive male role models showing younger men the path to acceptable manhood. Showing young men how to become a man in a manner that is effective and safe is a longer term strategy for decreasing suicide, I believe." So let me look a bit more what else we might do. So at a population level, which is really what fascinates me, how can we as a society intervene in a manner that supports men to become psychologically stronger, to cope better, and therefore to be safer? One of them is to resist a tendency to stigmatize them, to blame them for their suffering. I've seen descriptions of the fact that, let's say, virtually all workplace deaths are men, 97%. And I've seen that described as a sign that men are just ridiculous risk takers and they simply don't take precautions, in effect to blame them for their own suffering and loss and death. We really have to avoid it. I believe we have to be very cautious with terms like toxic masculinity, ill-defined, stigmatizing, caricatured, and something of a denunciation. Not effective. You alienate the people you want to reach out to. Another thing would be to provide targeted services, to look at the way you provide mental health services in the public sector, and to say, do we target them in a way where they're most likely to be acceptable, to be endorsed, to be engaged with by men? Another thing is to look, as I said, at population type interventions to enhance men's coping and to fund appropriate research. This simply hasn't been a priority in the research world. Men's suicide has been noted, but there hasn't been a comparable or appropriate prioritization of this with regard to allocation of research funding. There hasn't been nearly enough research on this area and how to intervene at a social and population level. Let me talk a bit about enhancing men's coping, something, as you can tell, I'm very passionate about. The research of the clinical work so far shows that men tend to do best with approaches that are oriented towards skill training, that are seen as psychological skill and coping oriented. They teach more effective ways of coping with psychological suffering, whether that skill training is done through psychotherapy, a significant part of what I do with my male clients, helping them, showing them how to cope more effectively with divorce, with job conflict, etc. I also have developed self-care workbooks, which teach at a population level how to deal more effectively with mood and anxiety and so forth. And I send those out there for free, and there have been something like 1 million downloads over the past 10 years, especially relevant for men. Men would respond very well to that kind of skill-oriented, non-embarrassing, non-stigmatizing approach, even if they'd be reluctant to go to a clinic or to go to a psychotherapist. Community workshops. A lot of that work has been done in Australia and the UK, what are called the Men's Sheds program, but a range of things, sports events where you reach out to men in situations where they're likely to be, or you offer them, and this is just beginning, you offer them skills training in the community, just as they might get training in other kind of life-related skills. I think there's a huge potential for that. Online websites and tools, again, just beginning to explore what might engage men more effectively and teach them what they need to know. So we're at an early stage of developing, implementing, evaluating these kind of population level interventions. A group like this one, an initiative like this one, is a really important part of beginning that change, of moving along to be more effective. So let me just say a little bit about some research I've been doing, primarily with men. I've been working with first responders, a group for whom most of the people I'm focusing on are men of the male culture. And what's interesting is some of the skills that are most relevant to good, resilient psychological coping and would also be relevant in a suicide prevention program. One of them, for example, is maintaining balance between your work and your personal life, your friendships, your family, not becoming over-identified with the work that you do. That leaves you quite vulnerable. Another is self-compassion, accepting what you cannot do, not blaming yourself, not being harsh. And men, I think, are more likely to do that, to speak to themselves, to judge themselves in rather harsh and non-compassionate ways. To maintain social support, people you trust around you, people you can talk to. Men are more likely to let that go, to fail to recognize the value and importance of that. So those are examples of some of the coping skills that men would benefit from on a broad population level, and I think would be helpful in terms of reducing the kind of despair and desperation that can lead to suicide. One of my books is called the Antidepressant Skills Workbook. You can find it online. It's free, and it's designed to teach some real coping skills. And it's men, I think, who most of all should be accessing this kind of tool. So that, in brief, is what I think about men and suicide. And again, I really endorse this particular initiative and raising the awareness and the thoughtfulness about what we can do differently. Thank you.
Dan, that added a lot of value to the discussion. So if there are any questions, and there are also some folks online, so maybe we can unmute them if they have a question. I don't know, maybe Mark, if you can bring them up, they can maybe put their hands up, and then Mark can unmute them and you can try to include questions from online. Anybody here in this room? Yeah. Oh, then we'll come back to your.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I have lots of questions.
Yeah.
I have only one.
Sure. We took one of hers before. We'll come back to her for sure. Let's go to you.
I have very, I'm looking for someone who will kind of down-to-earth, streetwise man who will work with a group of people who are at risk, homeless people, because I have a little space and I want, and they're all into computers, you know? So I want the kind of leader who will just take lead, you know?
At risk,
Where do I find?
male, homeless.
Yeah, they're male homeless with every possible problem. And there is a basement in my building I have access to, and I'd like somebody to actually, you know, but I need a guy who is like strong and with toxic masculinity, yeah. It's okay.
Okay, so maybe I can just sort of reframe that.
Where do I find such a person?
Let me ask, Dan, if you can comment on the intersection of homelessness, poverty, and then mental health sort of crisis and suicide, or do those, is being homeless, is that kind of a risk factor for suicidal ideation and suicidal behavior?
What's really nice about the suggestion that person made is that what it does is humanize someone who otherwise can become caricatured, can become a stereotype. So when I walk on the streets of Vancouver past a homeless person, there is this immediate tendency not to see that person, not to see them as a person, but to make them something of an object, to distantiate myself, almost defensively, I think. Now, programs like that get past that, and they challenge that tendency to not see the person. And they say, this is a person with emotions and suffering and strengths who has a history, who might have been previously a working person who got injured, who became addicted to opioids, and is now this homeless person. But it takes you into the story of that person and therefore treats them with compassion. And I think all of us need to work on that.
Yeah, but where do I find such a person?
Well, we do work with a number of homeless shelters for men and other agencies that work with the homeless population. We may be able to help you connect the dots and put a program together.
So I should just try to.
You can certainly contact us. You can talk to me after the event today. We can exchange contact information. Yeah, appreciate your initiative on that. Yes.
Hi, Dr. Bilsker, it's Robert Samry, and it seems to me that the propensity for risk is a large part of why men are uniquely able to complete suicide or find themselves in that position. And I'm wondering if you know whether that is a mixture of nature, nurture stuff, whether that's directly related to testosterone that has nothing to do with, or very little to do with nature, and how you combat that if it's so.
Well, I mean, I do a psychotherapy practice, and I very much believe that there's a huge amount of change that is possible, whatever else your facticity is, whatever else you're coming in with from a biological or whatever point of view. I see the identity of the people I work with as influenced on the one hand by their biological makeup, which affects to some extent who they are physically and perhaps even to some extent how they feel. But also by culture, which gives them certain roles and practices that they learn, they're rewarded for. And then that other third thing that we don't tend to talk about as much, which is self-choice. And because I'm a great believer in the power of choosing yourself to be different, no matter what the facticity is, those conditions that have formed you, I really believe that's incredibly powerful, is that existential ability to choose to be different, to choose to handle things differently, to live your life differently. So that tends to be where I put my emphasis. There's background, there's nature nurture controversies and so forth, but I'm always impressed by the power individuals have to make that free existential choice to be different.
Do you believe that influences not just the decision to attempt suicide, but the way that attempt is made?
I think there are cultural influences that I see that influence the lethality of the method. And we really in men should be studying the reasons or the factors that contribute not just to the suicide attempt, but to using a lethal method. Not to get into it too much, but women taking overdoses, men using ropes and hanging themselves. I mean, these are terrifying choices they make, but there's a sense of a certainty of wanting to die, less ambivalence, the sense that they take action, and it may even be part of that masculine role, that once you reach that point, there's no going back, there's no ambiguity, you have to proceed in a way that is going to just end it. And men seem to be more fierce about that or more determined. And of course, they're just inhibited by alcohol far more likely as well, which increases that tendency. Whether there is something biological or genetic or neurochemical about men that makes them more likely to act in that kind of more violent way against themselves, I actually don't know. I haven't seen research that would make much of a case for that.
Let's go to the.
I was just going to say that I have read research that indicates that suicide attempts among women tend to be deliberate cries for help as opposed to intentions to complete the act. And so, as opposed to a suicide for a man being the end of the road, oftentimes what happens is that women end up accessing services through an incomplete attempt. And so it's actually the complete opposite sort of reason why somebody might even undertake or even contemplate that kind of action, where it has in some cases been referred to as attention-seeking behavior among women as opposed to an actual desire to end things when a man engages in that behavior as well. And so I think that we have to look at the way that society responds to suicide attempts among women as well, and how that opens doors in a way for somebody to be to have their vulnerability addressed by the system, as opposed to men obviously not seeing that as a path to being helped.
Thank you.
Do you want to comment on that? I'm just interested in what you have to say about that too.
Well, I think women are more likely to be reaching or expecting some kind of support or help, more open to it. I think men shut that door far more readily. I think that's culturally influenced, but close that door on the idea that someone is going to be there for them, that they're going to receive help and support, and are far more likely to say, that's it. What's been done is done. There's nothing out here for me. There's nothing here. I think men are more likely to reach that conclusion in a more definite and despairing way. Women retain more hope, it seems. At least that's what it suggests to us.
Perhaps because the society and resources are culturally, implanting that idea culturally that women services and resources are there for women, but they're not for men. I agree.
Just in terms of services, if I could pose a question of my own, Dan, I'm curious for social service agencies, mental health agencies that want to address this problem, want to do more for men who are in crisis, is it merely just kind of a superficial window dressing of more sort of male positive language to recruit men to these programs? Or are we talking about the need for a wholesale, revolution in how services are oriented at men? How profound a change is needed from the social service agency side to get more men accessing the kind of support that right now they're not getting it, they're not looking out for?
Well, my background is I spent a couple of decades as the psychologist on an emergency psychiatry unit in a hospital, and who I talked to all day long for 25 years were acutely suicidal people, men and women, more women, of course. From that, my feeling is there isn't nearly enough knowledge about how to intervene effectively to prevent suicide. By the time somebody was in hospital, we're talking about tertiary prevention. We're way down the road. It's a huge task. I don't think the public mental health system is terribly good at it and really needs to learn more. What you really don't want to do is go upstream. You want to go backwards towards secondary or primary prevention before someone is at that point where they have been stopped from hurting themselves. Before they're there, you want to have programs that are much more sophisticated for women and for men. I think our public system has so much to learn and hasn't really focused on this issue in the way that it should. It's not amenable to a medication in particular. Medication is not terribly effective for preventing suicide. And yet we have a system in Canada which tends to be about providing medications. And when the medication doesn't work, bit of a refocus on other issues. So I think we need to do some serious rethinking and serious research on more effective ways of intervening. And as I say, upstream, before it's the extreme crisis.
Thank you. We have a few folks joining us online. Did anybody who is live streaming this wish to ask a question of anyone?
Maybe type in the chat.
Mark, do you mind posing that to our online community? Anybody here? Any other questions?
Yes, if I could ask a question there, Justin, to Dan. Yes, I'm very concerned about family law. I mean, Dan, you mentioned divorce and loss of the marriage relationship. How do you feel that fatherhood? How do you feel about fatherhood? Is that a really important aspect of suicide? Have you ever found that, like, the need for having your children? I know, like, I do a lot of work on researching family law issues and stuff, and suicide and that kind of thing, and the problems associated with that. What are your comments on the importance of having your children after divorce?
So there's a whole change in your role as a result of the way divorce proceedings appear to go from the research I've read. And it's not just that you lose this extraordinary emotional connection to your child, which may well have been a primary source of meaning for you. You're also sometimes vilified. You're often sometimes given the impression that you're the problem, that you've been awful and that you yourself are basically a bad person. Those kind of messages are brutal to an individual, whether or not a man shows it. The suffering is internal. And I think the combination of a loss of a critical relationship, someone you love and have cared for, and you feel is your responsibility to care for in the world, and to have that be cut, and to do it in a way where you may well feel that you're being blamed for everything that went wrong, I think is just a devastating set of blows. Basically, the loss of meaning is one of the critical aspects of why people become suicidal. And that kind of slicing of your connections, your emotional connections to the world, can well be just a complete loss of meaning.
Thanks. Do you have any, could you lead me to some statistics? I've been looking for statistics on the percentages of suicide and then the causes and stuff. There seems to be a lot of confidentiality, I guess, that prevents a lot of this information to be made public. Is there, how could you find out how detrimental some of the divorce proceedings have been, statistically speaking? Is there?
It's not a particular focus of my research, so I wouldn't be the one to ask about the data on that. What I have read recently is something indicating that after divorce, men are far more likely to be in despair and depression and suicidal than are the women coming out of that situation. But as to digging into what that actually means, I'm not the guy to ask.
Much of that is,
thank you.
Sorry, much of that actually has been compiled, synthesized, and compiled on our website, behindthemask.com. Part of what we're trying to do with this campaign is to talk about those uniquely male situational factors that correlate with suicide, the major losses that Dan was referring to. So we have sections on our website, behindthemask.com, that look at relationship breakdown, that look at loss of employment, and that we're not ourselves necessarily the research experts, but we pull excerpts from some of the best sort of scholarship in those areas, and we have lots of references, so you can go and you can read the source material from peer-reviewed journals, journal articles yourself to explore exactly that question and other questions about the correlates of suicide for men. So it's obviously an important area. Now I think
I just wanted to make one comment that sometimes people have also horrible disabilities and they commit suicide. I'm involved with Party for People with Special Needs, which gives voice to people with disabilities, and it's a small party. And our leader recently committed a suicide. He was blind. He was jovial guy. He was comic. He was like a comic actor. He had hundreds of friends. Nobody expected it, and then he committed suicide because he was blind and he would never get out of it. There is like, what can you do? No counseling can help. Nothing. So there are sometimes situations where there's nothing that can be done.
Yeah, Dan, would you like to respond to that?
You know, I've often distinguished between someone's outer story and their inner story. And I remember being interviewed by a foodie magazine after Anthony Bourdain's suicide. And they said, how could this happen? He had everything. Everything was going well. He was brilliant and successful and incredibly admired. And for many people, he was our hero. Many people were shattered by this. And I said, well, that's the outer story of his life. I don't know the inner story. What was going on inside him that could have led him to feel despair and hopelessness, while from the outside, his life was going wonderfully. So with someone who is blind and you say that maybe that was the reason, I don't know what it was that gave that person's life meaning and why somehow that meaning failed. What changed that meaning no longer worked? Was it because of the disability ultimately being insupportable, or maybe a very different internal event happened? The reason you want men to be speaking more is because you need to know the inner story. We need to hear it so that we can share that and connect to it.
And this is, of course, why we have the website Look Behind the Mask. That's the point of that sort of symbolism, right? Is that it's not always clear from the way men portray their inner selves, what their inner selves are actually experiencing. We meant for this event to run for about an hour. We're closing in on an hour, so if there are maybe one or two last quick questions and answers, either in the room or our community online, take them real quick.
Yeah, one more.
Let's go here and then back to you, and those will be the last two real quick. Okay, please.
You referred to upstream, and one thing I haven't heard here is talking about legal reform and the ways that actually the legal system empowers, unfortunately, in the gender dynamic and the separation dynamic, empowers women and disempowers men on purpose. We have income tax law, we have family law, we have criminal law, and in all of these areas, men are legislatively disempowered. So I'm wondering if there's any work being done on legal reform. And I'm also wondering, I'm a displaced Torontonian now living in Montreal. Recently in Montreal, there was a story of a father who took his own life and his children's lives. And I wasn't able to find out any details, but what the story indicated was he had reached out for help. He did express that he was having problems, he had trouble at work. He checked himself into the hospital. And whether it was while he was in the hospital or shortly after he was discharged, his ex-spouse used this information to take custody of the children. So somebody who was actually reaching out to get help was then punished for it and separated from those children. That was what I could glean from the story. Obviously, as we've talked about, confidentiality with respect to family law and with respect to suicides and like suicide statistics and information, very difficult to really get accurate information. But I find it terrifying that someone who would actually take it upon, a man that would actually take it upon themselves to seek help would then be punished, and the consequence of that would be so extreme. The other thing that I've come across in my research is that in times when violence does explode and men do take their own lives or do take their children's lives, it seems to be in 90% of the cases they've already been to court. But there does seem to be a role to play here, the legal system, family law system. There's a definite correlation between what's happening in court, not just with facts, but with, as I said, legislative discrimination against men. And I wonder if there are organizations that are working on legal reform and looking at the problem from that point of view.
What makes a lot of these issues complicated is because they do intersect the way you're describing. So issues to do with family court and the treatment of fathers after separation or divorce, mental health issues, domestic abuse, and other forms of trauma. All of these things, poverty and homelessness, which we also heard about today.
Well, income tax law is what I mean, that, like the punishing child support tables and
all those legislative areas. They all intersect. I mean, one of the unique features of our organization, the Center for Men and Families, is that we look at all of those things actually, and we provide services, we do research, we do advocacy. I'm not trying to turn this into a commercial for our agency. I think it is necessary to look at how these things intersect with each other. That is the one thing very few people seem willing to do, is they can look at each issue in isolation and acknowledge the problem, but to say all of this stuff points to a sort of a systemic
gender bias.
Going to that step is often, a lot of organizations won't go quite that far. I mean, the fact that we do go that far, and you asked earlier about the audience here tonight, and I should say, I wasn't really going to mention this, but you provoked it a little bit, I guess, which I don't mind, is that we do have trouble. We do have opposition, frankly, to some of the work that we do. It's amazing to put on an event around suicide prevention, and not everybody's a big fan of it. Still do have that, and it does make marketing these sorts of events difficult, more so for some of our legislative focused events. But even when we're dealing with mental health, we've done some events around sexual abuse of boys and men, even those events get criticized and protested. It does make it a challenge. So the point is, we need your help. I mean, the only way to overcome that is those of us who think that these issues are literally, in this case, life and death, and many issues relating to boys and men are life and death. We need to work together. We are a charity. We accept tax-deductible donations. We need financial support. We need volunteers. We certainly need more help getting the word out about our activities. And I'll just end by reminding you that this is just the first of several events. We will continue in the new year. We will have more time actually to plan some of those events. Now that the Billboard ad is up, and that took some time, but that is actually getting quite a bit of media attention, as I indicated earlier. We will be focusing more on the events. Here at U of T, so important because it's the location of some tragic events revolving around some young men, but some of the other campuses as well, we want to bring these events to. So we do need your help. You can sign up to get on the email list and help us distribute that information just after we wrap up, and come talk to me about that. I think it is about an hour. I think we will conclude on that. Oh, did you have a, I'm sorry, you did have a final question.
It doesn't matter.
It's been answered?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Dan, did you want to say any last closing words here before we do adjourn our event?
Well, I think this kind of initiative can hook up with a kind of fundamental change in the way we view men and their psychological health, or men's suffering, and kind of give them personhood.
That's a good note to end on. I will just remind us, we are active on social media, so the discussion between events will continue online. You can use the hashtag Let's Talk Men. You can also find the Center for Men and Families at Men and Families. That's our monocle, both on Twitter and Facebook, so you can follow us on both of those platforms. And we will be sending out email notices about events in the new year. So let me thank Dr. Dan Bilsker, Joanna from our office, and all of you here and also online for joining us. This is a difficult topic, but it's only through discussion that we can actually make progress on behalf of the men that we love. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you at our next event. Have a good night.